Have you ever played a game that just felt so right? Like it was made specifically for you? Then, no matter how many times you go back to it, the game still manages to appeal to all of your senses? Mine was developed by Supergiant Games back in 2014. The studio is best known for their first game, Bastion, which was met with overwhelming critical acclaim all across the board. So naturally, after such an outstanding first product, people were eager to see what Supergiant Games would put out next. 3 years later, we got Transistor. I only actually got around to playing Transistor last year, which is natural for me. I've never really been on the cutting edge of anything, but that's beside the point. I picked up Transistor during one of the big Steam holiday sales and figured I'd try it out considering all the good things I'd heard. Then I proceeded to play the entire game, start to finish, in one massive play session. It was just so good. Every facet of the game was right up my alley, and the further I got, the more I found myself reveling in the whole experience. I could go on and on about how I loved this game, but that would get old really fast. Instead, I want to use this video as a means of explaining how the game managed to reach me, in the hopes of maybe convincing those who haven't played the game before to pick it up and try it. For starters, I should probably give you all a basic introduction to the game. Transistor is an isometric action RPG turn-based strategy game. That's a lot to unpack, but I'll be revisiting the gameplay in a little bit, so there's no need to worry. You play as the aptly named Red, a red-headed singer who lives in a cyberpunk-esque city called Cloudbank. After a post-concert meet and greet gone terribly wrong, Red is nearly assassinated by a mysterious group known as the Camerata. She manages to escape with her life and the weapon with which the Camerata would have done her in, a giant sword called the Transistor, but not without a few sacrifices. Both her boyfriend/husband/lover, it's ambiguous, and her voice appear to have been absorbed by the Transistor. So, the two work to find the Camerata in the hopes of finding a way of undoing all of this. The Transistor itself is chock full of surprises, being home to a number of deadly and destructive abilities Red can use to fight back the Process, a legion of robots that appear to be controlled by the Camerata. As you've probably observed by now, the whole game is just gorgeous. Instead of traditional cutscenes, the game splashes beautiful artwork with some limited animation. Each and every art piece is wallpaper worthy. Breathtaking quickly becomes the norm for Transistor. It's amazing. Even in game, all the levels, the characters, and the enemy designs are just lovely. Red is a very obvious choice to gush about. Her design is both clever and stylish. What was once an elegant gown has been ripped at the thighs for the sake of mobility, and covered up by her boyfriend's jacket. As a whole, the outfit looks as cool as it does beautiful, but it also tells a story about Red's character, subtly letting the player know how she got to this point. Then there's the Camerata. I'm a huge sucker for the old red, white, and black palette, but that's not even mentioning the designs themselves. They represent Cloudbank's elite, and their designs absolutely bleed prestige and elegance, while still remaining fierce and intimidating. Then you've got the Process, which is not just limited to interesting enemy designs, but instead quickly becomes an environment of its own, an aesthetic that rivals even Cloudbank's. On the topic of aesthetics, Transistor actually has 3 major styles that are present throughout the game, the first being that of Cloudbank's. The design of the city, from its architecture to the fashion, all the way to the posters you notice up on the walls throughout the game, are heavily inspired by Art Nouveau, more specifically Austrian Art Nouveau and the works of Gustav Klimt. Despite Cloudbank being a city on the cutting edge in a fictional future world, all of the inspiration for the design of the city seems to be set in the past, which works well in contrast with the second major aesthetic, that of the process. As the game progresses, more and more of the city is shown to be absorbed and manipulated by the process, being transformed from its usual warm golds and blues to a more cold and mechanical white and red. Where Cloudbank's original style symbolizes tradition and the ways of the past, the process is very much a symbol of the future, of change. What's interesting about the process's aesthetic is that despite the color choice coming off as mechanical, the designs of the enemy and the city as it's taken over is actually more organic. These two contrast on many different levels: warm and cold, past and future, nature and industry. It's really well done. The last major style is present all throughout the game, and it's also my favorite element of the game: the programming/computer science aesthetic. With a name like Transistor, you have to expect that there's going to be some sort of allusion towards computers or their inner workings. And the game does this in all sorts of subtle and not so subtle ways. Things like the process are pretty self-explanatory. The same with your attacks being called functions, and pretty much everything related to combat using functional notation, which just basically means that they have brackets at the end of the word. Stuff like crash or breach, for instance. Then there's smaller stuff in the world that is a bit more clever, like the name of the concert hall Red performs in being the empty set, which is a reference to the empty set in mathematics, which is just a set that contains no numbers. The same can be said for bracket towers, which are likely named after Royce Brackett in Universe, but are ultimately a fun way of referencing brackets as a symbol, which are heavily used in coding. That sort of stuff is really hit or miss with a lot of people, but it never takes away from the experience. I'm a programmer myself, so I got a huge kick out of that stuff. But someone else might go through the game, miss those references, and still have a great time. Alright, so now we gotta talk about the game's combat, cause holy shit guys, Supergiant Games aced this one. So like I mentioned before, the Transistor is jam-packed with all sorts of cool abilities that can be used in combat. Stuff like a short-ranged attack, a long-range beam, a massive explosion, etc. You could just use those in real time and hope that you can outmaneuver the process, but what you should probably make use of is a turn. When you start a turn, the whole world just stops, and you enter the planning phase of combat. In a turn, you have a limited amount of movement, whether that be walking or using abilities. It's all finite. You can take this time to move throughout the area and line up different attacks on enemies until you're out of moves, and then you go back to real time and do exactly what you planned out. It sounds a little complex, but once you've done it a few times, you really start to get the hang of it. You start off with just 2 or 3 abilities you can use, and they're all pretty straightforward. But as the game progresses, you get access to more and more functions. Of course, you can't have all your functions on at the same time. You have a limited amount of memory, which is just the game's way of keeping things balanced. You, the player, need to pick and choose which attacks you want on your hotbar at any given time. And if you level up and get a new attack that seems better, you can change your functions around as you see fit. Then you start unlocking different positions for each function. They can be in an active slot, which is just using them as an attack, an upgrade slot, which allows each function to give a buff to another function, and then there are passive slots, which allows a function to give red a buff. Each function in the game in turn has 3 different things it can do depending on where you end up putting it. Let's use the first function you get, Crash, as an example. When you put it in an active slot, Crash is a short-ranged attack that also causes most enemies to become temporarily stunned. When in an upgrade slot, Crash adds that stun effect to pretty much any other attack. Then, in a passive slot, Crash gives Red some more damage resistance, and an immunity to any stuns the enemies can dole out. With just one function, there are already all sorts of possibilities for setups, and different setups can appeal to the playstyles of different players. If you want to focus entirely on the strongest, most offensive moves, go for it. If you'd rather get strategic and focus on turning the enemy against each other, that's a perfectly viable way to play. You can come at Transistor's combat system from so many different angles, and that's just one of the many reasons why this game is so great. There's an extra layer to this though, a method through which the game encourages player creativity. Each function in the game is tied to a person within CloudBank, like how Crash is tied directly to Red. Within the description for a function, there's also room for a little story about said person. A little on who they are, what sort of role they play within the city, and a little backstory on their relationship to the Camerata. It's a fun way of world building and giving a bit of flavor text about the ability in question. Of course, you don't have access to the story right away. In order to unlock it, you need to use said function in each of the 3 slots. This gives players a fun incentive to experiment with different function combinations. They get to try out new functional setups and see if they enjoy how that plays, and in turn, they get to learn more about the world the game takes place in. This isn't for everyone, but it's still a clever way of incentivizing creativity for completionists or players interested in learning more about the world. There's also little training missions you can do on the side which kind of force you to experiment with your setups, but they do give you a bit of experience and access to one of the game's many stellar music tracks. Music, you might ask, in a stereotypically inquisitive voice? Hell yeah, this game has music, and it's some of my favorite video game music, like, ever. The soundtrack for this game was lovingly composed by Darren Korb, with vocals provided by Ashley Barrett, and holy fuck, this soundtrack is amazing. I'm just gonna shut up here and let this track kick in. Isn't that just a treat for the ears? Fucking spectacular. Also worth mentioning, in-game you have a designated hum button, so they just went ahead and made a full hum track for every single song on the soundtrack. They definitely 100% didn't have to, but they went ahead and did it anyways. Now I could go on and on all day about this game, and of course it's not perfect, everything has its flaws. Transistor just happens to be a game packed full of things I adore. The game goes above and beyond, giving players a truly memorable experience. I hope that with all of my rambling, I've at least managed to convince one person to go and pick up this game. It's 4 years old now, it's bound to be pretty cheap too. If you've already played it and it's been a while, go check it out again. It's got a challenging new game plus, but if you'd rather start from scratch, the fun is still there too. Transistor is a thrilling, creatively enriching, and ultimately enjoyable game. And that's why I love it. Thank you again for checking out this video. If you have any thoughts on what I've said or on Transistor as a game, just let me know down in the comments. Make sure to follow us at DigiDreamClub on Twitter, and have a nice day.